Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at Ruth chapter 2 as we see what happens under the Lord's wings. Back in chapter 1, we had the story beginning with a famine. Now as the story begins, it begins at the season of harvest. Now that's the early springtime in the book of Ruth. That's springtime in Israel. That's when harvest takes place. In chapter 1, we had the bulk of the story taking place in Moab. Now in chapter 2, as it opens up, we're back in Bethlehem. In chapter 1, we were under the shadow of death. We had 3 funerals. Now in chapter 2, there's going to be the promise of new life. Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So now Boaz is introduced. Verse 2, and Ruth the Moabitess, and always the reminder that she's an outsider. She's from Moab. She's not from the promised land. She's not an Israelite. Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor, I may find grace, and is the Hebrew word there. And she said to her, go, my daughter. What would happen among a people who were poor, the poor were allowed to go into the field of the rich. They couldn't take a basket with them, but they could pick up whatever grain they could hold in their hand, and that would allow them to feed themselves enough to not starve to death. And Ruth is asking, we would say, can I go on welfare? Can I go collect food stamps? Can I do something that the poorest of the poor need to do to sustain myself? Verse 3, so she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech, just in case you had forgotten. Verse 4, now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. Now this is, the field wouldn't be in Bethlehem. It would be somewhere outside in the fields nearby. But he has been in the town, and he comes from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. And, the greetings are given in both directions. Verse 5, then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? Notice the phrase young woman. That's not just being polite. It's actually the word the youth. You can sort of underline it. And she apparently is young, and apparently we're going to get a hint along the way that he's not. This is not two people of the same age. He's an older man, and she's a young maiden. At least that's how she is perceived. Verse 6, the servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. And thus she came and has remained from morning until now. She's been sitting in the house for a little while. Verse 8, now Boaz approaches. Then Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter. There's another hint that there's an age difference between the two. I don't normally call a woman who's near my age daughter. Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids, with my young ladies. Verse 9, let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. Now that was significant, because an outsider, somebody who was a stranger, was always in danger of being abused. If you don't believe that, look at the previous stories back in the book of Judges. One of those, at least, is a story of sexual abuse. And so Boaz has put his word of protection upon her. I've commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. Verse 10, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Now there's a play on words there, because the phrase take notice, and that's what it means, nakar, to take notice. Since I'm a foreigner, and again, it's translated correctly because it has that connotation here, but it's the same word, or at least a word very much like that, nakri. It's a offshoot of the same word. We would say, you've taken notice of me since I am an unnoticed one. But remember, the connotation here is foreigner. You have not deplored me, even though I'm a deplorable. You get the idea here. It's a play on words. And she's a foreigner, and normally you don't take care of foreigners, but he's taking care of her. Verse 11, Boaz replied to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me. After all, Bethlehem's a very small town, and everybody had heard about everything, and that's the case here. And how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and how you came to a people you did not previously know. And the language that we're going to see here, as Boaz describes her, is reminiscent of the language that had been used back in Genesis chapter 12 when God had said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house, the land that I will show you. Here in Ruth chapter 2, as Boaz is describing her actions, he says, all you've been done has reported to me, how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth. That sounds like what Abraham had done. And you've come to a people you did not previously know. Abraham went to a place where he didn't know, where he was a stranger. And so we see Ruth being described in Abraham terms. Now remember, she's not only not Jewish, she's a Moabite. She's a stranger, a foreigner. But she's being described very much the way Abraham had been described. And so Boaz says, may the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel. And notice this phrase too, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Now that's a figure of speech. We sort of get that. Under whose wings is sort of the idea of protection. But remember that phrase because we're going to see it in the next chapter. And so just sort of hold on to that, make a mental note so that when we get to chapter 3, when we talk about being under someone's wings, she had come to find protection under the wings of the Lord. You've come to seek refuge there. Verse 13, then she said, I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. Remember, that's underscored. She's an outsider. She's not like the other Hebrew, young ladies. Verse 14, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread into the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. And notice, he's taking care of her. He's seen that her needs are met. Verse 15, when she arose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. Now normally, you were supposed to gather the sheaves, and then that was for the owner. Just whatever they missed back on the ground, the poor could come and pick up. But Boaz says, no, let her just come and take from wherever, even though we've gathered her. Notice, do not insult her. You shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. And so he gives instructions that the servants are to take special care of Ruth. Verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley, and she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. So not only has Ruth been fed, but now Naomi also has been fed, and she's been provided for. Verse 19, her mother-in-law then said to her, where did you glean today, and where did you work? May he who took notice of you be blessed. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, the name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz. And so his name comes to Naomi, and she's heard of him. Verse 20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead. Now remember what Naomi had said before. The Lord has dealt treacherously with me. The Lord has dealt very hard with me. I'm bitter. But now she realizes, wait a minute, the Lord hasn't withdrawn his chesed, his kindness, I like the better translation, his loyalty to the living and to the dead. Again, Naomi said to her, "The man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives." The Greek phrase there, me goel nu. Remember that word goel, maybe you've heard of it. That's connected to that word for redeemer. Now, he hasn't redeemed him yet, but he's in the position to do that, and this is a hint of what is coming in the next chapter. And so, verse 21, then Ruth the Moabitess said, furthermore, he said to me, you should stay close to my servants until they finish all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maid, so that others do not fall upon you in another field. In other words, that's a safe place. That's good that you found a safe place. Verse 23, so she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So our chapter comes to a close. Now, last time we noted that this time of the year, the time of the barley harvest, was the time of Passover. And we noted that in the New Testament, that's the time when Jesus was crucified and buried and rose again from the dead. But our story, when it picks up, we're going to be at the end of the harvest, and when we pick up, we're going to move forward to the time of year known as Pentecost. And of course, it's a reminder for us that Jesus, yes, he came and died and rose again from the dead, but then 50 days later, something took place that brought Gentiles into the church. And that's what's happening here in the book of Ruth. As a Gentile is going to come into the covenant community. But we'll read about that next time.